Hi. John Wesley Bready, This Freedom Whence, page 215 in the section, the chapter, A Nation Reborn. He's been discussing Wilberforce and how he came to faith and now the impact he has through a group called the Clapham sect. He says, how thoroughgoing was Wilberforce's sense of stewardship and how deep his generosity are illustrated by the fact that in 1801, a year of dire unemployment, his gifts to the poor were such that, when he came to take stock, he found they had exceeded his income by £3,000. That, of course, could not long continue, but he disposed of property, eliminated luxuries, lived simply, and besides generous benefactions to scores of causes at home and abroad, rarely did he give less than a quarter of his income to the poor. To Hannah More's schools, for years he subscribed £400, that is $2,000 in the days, this is 1940 by the way, £400 or $2,000 per annum. With two friends he provided an annuity for Charles Wesley's widow, and to hundreds of Lascars stranded around London's docks, his purse was never closed. In old age, Wilberforce lost all his means, but refusing the gift of 6 friends who wanted to replenish his loss, he said goodbye to his beloved little estate and went to live alternately with 2 of his parson's sons, where, he believed, God prolonged his life to show him that a man can be as happy without a fortune as with one. To certain of the wilder radicals notwithstanding, this man was an ugly epitome of the devil, whose grandiose humanity was all expended upon fat, lazy niggers overseas, while Englishmen were enslaved or starved at home. Those phrases, by the way, are their phrases, not mine. He was a ranting hypocrite whose religion was a hollow sham. Cobbett, who had no sympathy with the African N-word, who lauded bull baiting, prize fighting, and the like as manly sports, who aggressively encouraged the rotten egging of Methodists, and whom even Place pronounced a mountebank, always had Wilberforce in the pillory of his political register. Quote, if all published about me was true, said the same, that is Wilberforce, as early as 1816, nothing but a special providence can have prevented me from being hanged 30 years ago. End of quote. Wilberforce was but typical of that remarkable group of men historically remembered as the Clapham sect, so dubbed by Sydney Smith because many of them lived around Clapham Common, and because their chief haunt was the Chatham-designed library of Henry Thornton in Clapham. This group included statesmen and men of affairs whose daily contacts extended to the ends of the earth. Among them were a Governor-General of India, a chairman of the East India Company, the King of the Colonial Office, several members of Parliament, a governor of Sierra Leone, the head of a great banking house, and philanthropists and publicists whose ceaseless sacrificial labors benefited millions of their fellow men. Among them were Anglicans, nonconformists, and Quakers, conservatives, liberals, and independents. Their common bond was evangelical Christianity, and their common enthusiasm, the application of the ethic of Christ to personal, political, national, and international affairs. None of them claimed to be theologians, nearly all were laymen, but all were Bible students, men of prayer. All accounted themselves stewards and missioners of the kingdom of God, and all devoted themselves with amazing initiative to the practice of the faith they professed. Something altogether new to the British Empire was this coterie of Christian statesmen and philanthropists, giving so freely of their time, talents, and means that public life might be Christianized, and that the empire might become an instrument of moral and social welfare to all peoples. Most of the Clapham brethren were members of the Church of England. All, being fervent evangelicals, were Protestants, but the most amazing feature of their lives was the true Catholicity of their humanitarian crusade. The Clapham sect was directing influences which ennobled the life of colored and primitive peoples the world over, before ever an evangelical was elevated to the episcopal bench. And were it not for the influence of such lay saints, evangelical Christianity might have been quite cold-shouldered from the national church. A businessman's ledger affords a revealing commentary on his life. Many years after his death, a granddaughter of Henry Thornton, the banker, published figures from his accounts, which show that during the years 1790 to 1793, he gave to charity no less a sum than £20,408, while his total expenditures for all other purposes were but £6,964. On different years before his marriage, Thornton gave away as much as 6/7 of his entire income, and such devotion was characteristic of all the Clapham brethren. Granville Sharp, although too poor for a parliamentary career, gave lavishly of his time, talents, and means in the Negro's cause. Zachary Macaulay faced fever and bore labors sufficient to kill half a dozen ordinary mortals in establishing the freed slave colony at Sierra Leone, while later he labored for years without pay as editor of the famous evangelical magazine Christian Observer. James Stephen turned his back on a brilliant and lucrative career as advocate in prize cases before the Privy Council to serve as Undersecretary for the Colonies, a post later occupied with equal distinction and devotion by his son Sir James. The consecration of Clarkson's life was equal to that of Wilberforce. As for other members of this Christian brotherhood, they included Lords Teignmouth and Glenelg, Charles Grant, William Smith, John Venn, and Edward Elliot, together with Gisborne, Milner, Babington, and Bowdler, while for all practical purposes, Hannah More was also a member. That's the Quaker who had been one of the founders of the anti-slavery movement. All regarded their vocations as sacred callings. All conceived their time, abilities, and possessions as stewardships held in trust for the God of righteousness, the Lord of heaven and earth. This Clapham sect rose splendidly above the barriers of party, class, creed, color, and nationality. Inspired by a common faith, humanitarian questions they saw with a single eye, and concerning them they spoke with a single voice. No exclusive pietists were those lay saints in projects for the common good. They would, and did, cooperate with Catholics, Unitarians, and Utilitarians. In Parliament, their influence was out of all proportion to their numbers. Into the whole Indian and colonial administration, they injected a new moral leaven, conceiving of the overseas empire not as a gold mine for British exploitation, but as a sacred trust to be developed for the highest good of the people's concern. At home, they furthered schemes of education and self-help among the poor. Abroad, they created and sponsored missions of a highly practical mold, especially in benighted communities. Everywhere, they stood for peace and cooperation among peoples of goodwill. Whatever the limitations of the Clapham fraternity, this Christian body, in proportion to numbers, did more than any other group in English history to impregnate the British Empire with Christian ideals, particularly as they applied to backward peoples, who up to this time were being exploited and enslaved. Payne, Place, Cobbett, Hazlitt, and company would, of course, continue to rail at them as arch hypocrites, but the fury of the assault attested the wide influence the saints were exerting over the conscience of the realm. And in the next section, he does deal with the wider impact of the Clapham group. Put in a link to the real unity of Christians. The Apostles' Creed, which testifies now for over 1,600 years to the basic unity of the divisions or denominations of Christendom.